Our next presenter is Gordon Houlden, and Gordon has been a diplomat. He's been in the embassy in Beijing for about 3 years, I think. Gordon, you were there, and been through
two tours. I had two tours in Beijing.
tours in Beijing.
80s in this century. Go ahead.
And recently has been doing the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta and a professor of political science with the University of Alberta, as well as a number of other things that, as we talked about earlier, your resume is too long for me to read, Gordon, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to toss it over to you and ask that you would go forward with your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Doug and Perry. And it's never easy to follow Consul General Liu. She's a wonderful presenter, but I shall do my best. I'll start by sharing my screen. And congratulations to KEI also group for organizing this presentation. I'm going to focus on a report which was done by the China Institute, commissioned by the Canada-China Business Council, asking the China Institute to look at what exactly is the significance of the economic relationship between Canada and China. We think we all know it. 4.8% of our exports, pretty tiny percentage, but still number 2. But what does that actually mean in terms of numbers? What does that translate in terms of effect on Canadians? Because as you may know, I'm sure you know that there's a multiplier effect. If you put a factory in a small town, it's not just the wages paid to those factory workers, but also the service industries that it generates. So you have an echo effect, which can be much larger than the original investment. And we had at the China Institute, we have access to a core within our institute and in the broader university, a core of PhD students, postdoctoral students, economists who can assist us in the drafting of this report, who assisted us in the drafting of this report in terms of the getting the macro sense of what this all meant. Now, for a start, most Canadians, now we went with 2019 stats for a couple of reasons. Number one, most of the some of the service industry reports aren't captured in the 2020 report. And secondly, while, and Madame Liu is quite correct, the goods exports increased in 2020, the service exports declined slightly, and I'll explain why that is. So that is a lot of money. And in fact, services, well, what are services? Well, there's several things that might not be front of mind for many people. One is students. Now, we're in a situation where the number of student visas issued this year, 2021, will still be very large. Students are flowing back into Canada, slowed by a couple of things. One thing that will help is that Canada recently recognized as acceptable the Chinese vaccines, which were accepted already by the World Health Organization. That will mean for Chinese students easier to come into this country. Another huge service component, the one that's still missing, and that is Chinese tourists. And that won't rebound until we see the end of COVID, I'm afraid. One little aside here, when it comes to the educational exports, the University of Toronto receives more money from Chinese students paying relatively high differential wages than they do from the government of Ontario. Huge tax savings for the people of government, for the taxpayers in Ontario. More money from Chinese students than from the government of Ontario in supporting what is Canada's largest university. We estimate the total impact in Canada at $76.9 billion, let's say $80 billion. So that's over triple the amount of the actual generation by trade in both goods and exports. The total amount of jobs created, 365,000, let's say 300, I think we could safely say 365,000 jobs created by the China trade in 2019, which is, again, not something you see in the headlines. All you see is Canada's second largest trading partner, almost 5%, but it doesn't begin to capture. And calculating this number is way more complicated than you might think. Department of Global Affairs Canada did an estimate a couple of years ago, but they looked at simply the jobs created as a percentage of exports. But here's the thing, exports to China are more employment concentrated than is the case of exports to the United States. So their numbers, that is Global Affairs Canada, understated the job creation effect of the China trade and overestimated that for the United States. This is a question of, if you have a pipeline, I'm all in favor of exporting oil, but if you have a pipeline generating oil out of the ground, it's not as job intensive as is much of the China trade. And keep in mind that China trade includes services. And when you look at BC, where I'm sitting right now, or Alberta, where my university is located, that tourism business generates a tremendous number of jobs in the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, often jobs in smaller towns, often jobs to people who may not have high quality credentials, but still need work. So there's a job creation factor there, which is particularly significant in the case of China. And again, $18 billion in wages generated, looking at both the direct trade and the spin-off effect of the China trade. As well, in that 10-year run from 2011 to 2020, merchandise exports increased by 50% more than our exports to other countries at 16%. So the trend line is upward. Now, I would add, in my opinion, I think we're underachieving, despite the efforts of both governments over the years, despite the efforts of business people on both sides. I think we can do better. One of the excuses is often distance. Well, quite frankly, the sea lane shipping distance from Sydney, Australia to Shanghai is slightly longer than the distance from Shanghai to Vancouver. So I think that's a rather poor excuse. To me, the bigger problem is what I call psychological distance. The Australians, admittedly, Australia is having a complicated relationship with China right now, but their trade is booming, particularly with the price of iron ore being high. Canadians tend to psychologically identify with North America, see themselves as North Americans. They identify, because of heritage, perhaps with Europe. The idea that we are a global trading country doesn't occur to most Canadians. Asia is reachable, for heaven's sakes. It was possible to trade with Asia in the era of sailing ships. We can certainly do it now with multiple passenger connections. So it's that psychological distance that is a problem. And that, to me, is ultimately an educational issue. I'm not making a pitch for the University of Alberta or University of Calgary, where David Wong is sitting. I can see him smiling. It's rather, I think, something has to begin even earlier. People need to begin to realize how trade dependent we are. Here's three numbers. Here's the percentage of GDP generated by trade for three countries. United States, 24. China, 37. Canada, 64. 64. So in this big country, where only 37 million people rattle around in this rather empty country, we are hyper dependent on trade. That ought to be drilled into kids in every school. And of course, many Canadian businessmen know that, but perhaps not all. Of course, when Madame Liu speaks about China's dual circulation model, they are, as is large countries with large economies and large populations can do, they're attempting to increase the amount of internal circulation, build an internal market, much as the US has succeeded in doing. We don't really have that option, quite frankly, given our population size. Trade ought to be job one for any Canadian government. And I'll hit the next slide here, just a moment. Here we go. Should also note that in drawing up this, in doing this study, we had the cooperation of the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, because we also needed to get data from Chinese state enterprises. And understandably, they were comforted by the fact that we had the support of the Chinese embassy. The report wasn't done for Chinese embassy. It was done for the Canadian organization, China Business Council. But I thank the embassy for their help in allowing us to interview. And we, the China Institute, have capacity to work in Chinese language just as readily as in English. I speak Chinese, but we have native Chinese speakers who made that rather simple. Here's something where, again, I think we could do better, but it's been complicated, and that is the Chinese investment in Canada. And in fact, we have the China Institute maintains the most detailed trade statistics on Chinese investment into this country. You can see them dropping. Those numbers are dropping. The total number would be in the range of about $80 billion. But the amount of investments is dropping, and there's several reasons for that. Number one, I think that China itself has put some curbs on investment abroad. Some large state enterprises working in insurance, for example, were buying real estate. China wanted those state enterprises to stick to their core business. I understand that, and that made good sense. And China also has some concerns about capital flight. But there were other problems as well. Some of the investments turned out not to be that successful. Some in the energy business, for example, China bought at a time of high energy prices, and some of those deals did not turn out to be favorable for the Chinese side. They were, in my opinion, favorable for the shareholders of the companies that sold, mind you. So we Canadians ought not to complain about that. The third is, and this is a significant factor as well, Canadian government has become very choosy about which investments it approves. So many investments were turned down on security grounds, some fairly, perhaps some unfairly, in my personal view. I think a more open attitude of federal and provincial and municipal governments, even, to investments that generate trade. One I was very unhappy to see disappear was a $400 million investment in Western Ontario in a glass float plant, basically making very large sheets. We import all of that. This would have allowed Canada to have a domestic production in float glass. I saw no particular problems with that, but it was not ultimately approved. It did not go forward. Here's investment by sector. You can see heavily mines and minerals. China is the number one importer. China dominates the trade in metals and minerals, taking over 50% of the global trade in iron ore, zinc, copper, and several other minerals. That's natural. And so they are looking to source these materials in Canada. We benefit from that. China gets diversity of source. We get diversity of destination, investment destination. So to me, that's a classic mutual benefit. And I think it refers to something Madame Liu spoke about, which is the fundamental compatibility of the two economies. What they have, we often don't, and we have, they don't have. So there can be a benefit in both directions. Entertainment and real estate, I think commercial real estate would be the biggest component of that. That's growing. Number one in BC, number two in Ontario, flowing somewhat less to Alberta now. Energy investment is still coming in, but not on the scale that it did previously. Those big energy investments that were made in the first 2 decades of this century, we'd have to have a whole other scale if we were to capture those. And you can see health and biotech. So three things are happening. There's a diversity occurring in destination by province. There's a diversity in sector, and there's a diversity away from simply state enterprise to state enterprise and private investment coming out of China. Private doesn't mean, of course, small. It can mean very large. In fact, my standard comment is that Chinese, Canadian, large companies are mid-sized by Chinese standards, and our medium-sized ones are small by Chinese standards. That makes dealing in the China market, some of the people here, like Doug and like both Dougs that are here, Doug Horner and David Wong, both know that difference of scale is a challenge for a Canadian company, particularly if they want to take on the entire China market. If they get advice from consulates, Canadian and Chinese, from governments, Canadian and Chinese, local authorities, and from experts, they can perhaps hone in. Even for a small Chinese Canadian company with a great idea, there can still be a place, but it is not as easy given that differential size. I'll just say a couple of words. I'm already, I think, largely through my time. Madame Liu made some references to the diplomatic situation, which is for the last almost precisely 3 years been very bad by the historical standards of the relationship. I will say a couple things though about that. Number one, I'm now in my 35th year of full-time work on China. I've been through a few of these cycles. This isn't the only one. It's maybe one of the deepest, but it's not the only time that relations have suffered. And perhaps I might comment that when you're at a low ebb, perhaps the natural direction might be upward. And I think that is like that. I'm not just being hopeful there. I think, quite frankly, a couple of things that I saw during this crisis are significant. Number one is that the trade levels on the goods side continue to grow at a time, as Madame Liu noted, when our goods trade with even our principal economic part of the South suffered, the China trade did well. I would say one needs to look a little bit beyond the rhetoric. Of course, there's rhetoric comes from, I'm not in government any longer, I can speak my mind freely, but there's rhetoric that comes from Beijing, there's rhetoric that comes from Washington, and there's rhetoric that comes from Ottawa. But I sometimes like to look, but what is the substance? And I'll tell you one interesting thing that happened in 2020. US investment moving to China burgeoned, both portfolio investment and foreign direct investment. Why? Because the Chinese economy was still growing, albeit at a slow pace compared to what it traditionally did, but also because Chinese supply chains are very healthy and growing. So the big American multinational corporations want to be part of those supply chains, and those supply chains radiate into Asia. They radiate towards Africa, Latin America, etc., Middle East. They're global in scale, but particularly into Asia, they're particularly strong. So those, I think, the economic reality belie some of the rhetoric. The rhetoric, of course, is serious, and we have to hope that U.S.-China relations will do well. When that relationship does well, it tends to be a bonus for Canada as well. We're not necessarily completely tied, but we're certainly heavily influenced by the country to our south, which is our ally, but also our principal economic partner. So I wish strong relationship, and I took some comfort from the recent C. Biden virtual bilateral. There's still tough talk out of Washington, tough talk out of Beijing, but I'm also seeing some positive signs. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has been to Beijing for consultations, and I took one particular note of what the USTR representative, Catherine Tai, said when she was interviewed after her return in a recent speech. And during the interview, she said, she was asked, are we going to see a decoupling? She said, well, that's not the US goal. We might even see some recoupling, a word I've never heard before. So again, I don't mean to be Pollyannish, but I think we need to look for some positive signs amidst the negativity. The negativity, quite frankly, will always be there. I was a diplomat. I got quite used to that. Behind closed doors, diplomats bang on tables and usually don't shout, but they exchange strong words. But from my experience, usually at the end of that, they shake hands and they meet again in a few weeks and carry on. And I think we need to be realistic about that. One thing that does need repair, though, in my opinion, and that is the public opinion in Canada of China is at a low ebb. There's no point denying that. Madame Liu acknowledged that. And that will take time as well. But again, I've lived through several cycles, and I do believe that we're at the bottom. I hope, but I also believe we're at the bottom ebb of a cycle that we'll see a measure of rebound. I think it'll take some time to heal, but that we will see that rebound, and we need to see also some restarting of contacts, and that includes travel. I very much look forward to the loosening up of the travel restrictions are COVID-based. They make sound sense. China's done an amazing job of fighting COVID, but I think at some point, I think Chinese side would agree we need to have a reopening of that door so tourists can go in both directions, that students go in both directions. It's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen in January 2022, but let's hope that it happens before the end of 2022. I know that I have Madame Liu agreement that she would like to see that. And of course, it'll depend on the health situation. Those very talented health experts and public health experts in China will give the signal, and the Chinese government will agree at the right point. But that is something we do need, because I'm fearful that the longer it goes on, if we end up with not just 2, but 3 or 4 years of closure between our two countries, there's a loss there, particularly for young Canadians who need to get to China and see China. And we need to get those tourists and young Chinese coming to our country as well. I could go on more about the economy. I think I'll stop there, given the time limits. Thank you.
I think we've got a few minutes here, Perry, for some questions from some of the folks. And I know that in the chat room, there's a lot of stuff happening relative to what the perception of doing business in China and the reality of doing business in China has been. And I think that's important. And Gordon, I saw you throw your hand up. I wanted to just throw two questions out. I'll ask you the first one, and I'm going to ask the second one to Madam New. The first one is, Gordon, we talk a lot about the fact that Canada needs to understand the relationship better, and we need to work better at it. How do we get the message that you brought forward about the job creation, the investment, the importance that China is to Canada? How do we get that message to federal, and I'm a recovering politician, so I'm asking a question of you, but how do we get that message to federal policymakers, federal decision makers, federal bureaucrats that you worked with in the past? How do we get that message to them to say, part of the problem is you are telling Canadians it's bad? How do we get them to say, you should be telling Canadians we need this market? Gordon, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's an important question. And one concern I would have in our discussion, and the chat questions have been posed, the chat comments, is that these are not the typical views of Canadian media. These are not the typical views that you find in the coffee shops and in the general conversation. And that is a problem. In other words, those here today, in my opinion, were a minority who have this, are prepared to overlook the downsides and are prepared to take a very positive look. The CCBC, with this report, it's an 80-page report. It's not a thriller to read. I highly recommend. It's on our website. It's on the CCBC website. I commend it to you. It's 80 pages. If you have trouble sleeping, there's your cure. But the reality is that those stats ought to be brought to the attention of every political leader. CCBC has sent it to the Prime Minister's office, to every federal minister. I've had discussions with the federal government officials, senior officials, and I think they're not objecting to that at all. They understand that. But you saw the throne speech. You made reference to that. It wasn't one of you made a reference, one of the speakers, to the throne speech. There's a reference there to Indo-Pacific. I think the government gets that Asia, we must focus more on Asia. It's not politically desirable now to be able to focus on China, even post the ending of our consular issues on both sides. I think that, on the other hand, in my conversation, it's perfectly clear the government does not want to harm that trade with China. They want to grow it. But the political superstructure is still a problem. That diplomatic side is a problem. And I think it's not just a question of sending it to ministers. You're the politician, Doug, the leader. It'll take a lot of leadership, because right now the media is hostile, and the populace, influenced by the media, is also hostile. And there are some reasons which are legitimate for that. There are real issues. Canada has some genuine issues with China. China has some genuine issues with Canada. Let's not be Pollyannish or pretend that everything is sweetness and light. There have been real problems, and I think the Canadians have some reason to be unhappy about that. But we've got to get past that. It will take leadership in Ottawa, leadership in every provincial government, and it'll take a concerted effort to somehow counter some of the media, which sometimes says the truth. Just one more minute, if I could. I could make a movie about the United States, which would be guns, ghettos, and polarized politics. I could make a movie about the United States, which would be the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harvard University, and Silicon Valley, and it'd all be true. And I could do the same thing with China. The problem we have right now is the only movie we see, the only media comment we see, is 100% the negative. China's 20% of the earth. They're not all saints. There's issues there. They don't have a perfected life, but we only see the negativity. We don't see the positivity. In this chat room here we do, but how do we change that media message? And how do we get our politicians to have enough leadership to get them to look beyond the media and to lead the public? That to me is the big challenge.